All right, welcome everybody to our Free Speech Cafe, our We Talk. I think this is about the sixth one of these that we've done as part of our We Talk program here at Western, which is dedicated to helping people learn how to have difficult conversations. I'm Jessica Schwartz. I am the Deputy General Counsel here at Western and have the pleasure of getting to do a lot of free speech work on college campuses. And I will let my two colleagues introduce themselves.
Hello, so my name is Paula Davis and I am the Director of Strategic Communications out of the Office of Strategic Marketing and Strategic Communications.
Yeah, and my name is Caitlin Petrillo, and I am the social media coordinator over in marketing and strategic communications as well.
Wonderful, thank you. So we are here today to talk about social media and free speech. Obviously, it's a very cutting edge topic, and we're all kind of learning as we go along. So just to start out, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of some elements of free speech to keep in mind as we're thinking about this. So there's a couple of types of speech. We've got political speech and we've got commercial speech. Political speech, speech about a public topic, is entitled to the highest level of protection in our country. That means that the government can regulate it, but only a little bit. There has to be a substantial, legitimate interest in the government to regulate political speech. Another issue or another topic to keep in mind is that free speech only applies, the free speech protections only apply when the government is the one who is coming in and telling you that you can't speak. It doesn't apply to private entities, and something to keep in mind there is, for example, the NFL. When we've seen over the last years players kneeling for the national anthem, that is an expression of speech, but the NFL is a private entity, as opposed to players who are kneeling at public university football games, when the university really can't, unless there's other factors involved, step in and make them stop saying that. So to keep in mind when we're talking about free speech, it's always a balancing test. There isn't a 100% all the time, no matter what you say, is protected. There's always a balancing between the government's interest and the individual's interest. Most of the time, if you're doing political speech or something about a matter of public interest, and when I say political, I don't mean Democrats versus Republicans, I mean a matter of public interest, most of the time the individual's rights will be stronger than the government's right to regulate that, but not always. Now, the interesting thing when we're talking about social media is social media platforms are privately owned. However, they are pretty much the definition of a public forum, in that anybody who wants to can come and speak on these private platforms. So the question then is, how do these two things fit together? And the courts really we're working through this right now. The case that's the closest on point came up from President Trump and his Twitter account, when he had blocked a few people from his account while he was president because they were saying things he didn't like. And as we all know, President Trump used his Twitter account quite frequently to issue statements of public policy, issue statements about foreign policy. So that went, the people who were blocked sued President Trump saying, you can't block me, this is a public forum. And it went to the Second Circuit Court, which is a pretty well-known, it encompasses New York. A lot of other courts will look to it for its rulings. And the Second Circuit said, in this matter, as soon as President Trump, even though he had the Twitter account as a private citizen, he continues to have it as a private citizen. Well, he got kicked off, but he would have continued to have it as a private citizen. While he's using it to make these public statements of public policy on things that the United States is doing as an official matter, it has become a public forum. And in that case, then the government, i.e. President Trump, cannot block people from reacting to it based on the content of their speech. President Trump appealed that to the Supreme Court. It got to the Supreme Court after President Biden was elected. The Supreme Court granted cert, which means they had to get to the Supreme Court, they have to say, yeah, we want to hear your case. They took it and they said, you know what, this is a moot case. President Trump is no longer in office. So it doesn't matter what he was doing at that point in time. Justice Thomas wrote a really interesting concurring opinion to that. And in the legal world, a concurring opinion, you have the main opinion, which states the rule that you have to follow. The concurring opinion agrees with the outcome, but disagrees with how they got there. So for example, this is what my torts professor, he told us, in like first day of law school. So your primary opinion is, I'm wearing short pants because I like how they look, okay? Your concurring opinion is, I'm wearing short pants because I think there's a flood coming. Either way, you're wearing short pants, but there's two different ways that you got there. So Justice Thomas's concurring opinion, which doesn't have precedential value, but kind of indicates what they would do what he would do if it got there, said, you know, it makes sense that the Second Circuit would say that this was a public forum because of all of the reasons that they said. He's issuing, public policy. But then he said, and as we can see by the fact that Twitter unilaterally shut down the president's account, they have ultimate control. So when we're looking at matters of public forum, public policy, when the government can step in, usually we're looking at situations where the government is the one who can say, you need to stop talking. In this case, it was Twitter who said, you need to stop talking. And so we don't know what's going to happen with that. We don't know where that's going to go, but there's so many good and interesting questions that come out of that because of the lack of regulation on Twitter. And, is it private? Is it public? So with that, I just wanted to, in the state of Michigan, when we're talking about cyber, we've got a cyberbullying statute here, which prevents you from threatening or harassing with the intent to threaten somebody. And there's a lot more words in there, but that's the general gist of it. What's noticeable here is that our statute requires intent of the person issuing it. So it's not whether I feel threatened when I received it, it's whether the person intended to threaten me when they sent it. And that's different than some other statutes in other states. Also in Michigan, the case law says that when you have our speech over the internet is entitled to the same protections as your regular speech out in public. But again, that raises the question of, but what if it's a private entity that has control over that internet platform that you're using? So with that, and I'll intersperse a little bit more, and I did want to ask, has anybody here been shut down on social media or know somebody who's been shut down? And by shut down, I mean their post has been removed or they have had their account suspended. Has anybody had that experience? Were you willing to share?
I can't remember the details of it because I'm not on social media myself, but I have had friends that have issued political opinions and had their account shut down temporarily.
Okay.
Or had tagline, I don't know, for lack of a better word, that said, this is disputable information, that kind of thing.
And what were their, to the extent you can remember, what were their reactions? What were their thoughts?
Well, everybody's offended when they're told to shut up.
Right. She said everybody's offended when they're told to shut up. True statement?
Yeah, their reaction was, yeah, maybe I'm not super surprised, but it shouldn't be happening.
Okay, yeah. So she said they were not super surprised, but they felt like it shouldn't be happening. Anybody? Oh, Emma.
I have an aunt who's a very active Facebook member, and she has a very acquired sense of comedy that Facebook does not enjoy. And so she's gotten put into Facebook jail, if you will, where they lock her account several times. Mostly because of, one one-off example was she had a bee's nest on her house and said she was going to burn the house down because there was a bee's nest on the house. But that kind of language automatically gets flagged. And now that she posts things like that commonly, because that's her sense of humor, Facebook does not enjoy the types of posts she puts up and kind of her, and it's not just Facebook, it's kind of this like offbeat sense of comedy that a lot of people maybe don't find funny.
That's really interesting. So just to repeat for our online audience, Emma was saying that she is an aunt who has kind of an off sense of humor that Facebook doesn't get. And so, for example, one of the times she got put in Facebook jail was because she said she was going to burn down her house because there was a bee's nest on it. And that's really interesting because that's not political speech, right? And so that's kind of a different sphere in terms of what a private or public entity can do in terms of limiting what that speech is. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paula and Caitlin to talk a little bit about, what do we do here at Western? And Paula was going to talk to us about kind of the rise of social media and some of the, benefits and harms and that sort of thing. So Paula.
Yeah, so in my professional career, I started as a newspaper journalist. And I remember in my earliest newspaper job, we had one computer with the internet on it. And it was like, the internet, ooh, this is so cool. What is this internet thing? And I remember we kind of regarded it as this digital library, right? And we did computer-aided reporting, so we could look up government documents and things of that nature. And so when I left the profession, though, 10 years ago, we were just beginning to post our stories on Facebook and get that kind of like immediate reaction and interaction with readers, and that was really interesting. And now for the profession, and I think a lot of us, social media is like a utility, right? You look at it all the time. Many of us, it's part of our daily jobs. It is Caitlin's job, for example. And depending on the profession, it's pretty much indispensable at this point in terms of a communications tool. But it also has its ills and it has its toxicity, and it has, some of the worst, I think, instincts of humanity. You see that showing up on social platforms, which is unfortunate. I wanted to share a little bit about the rise of social media. I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of statistics, but I will potentially bore you with a few. So I grabbed some statistics from the Pew Research Center. And Pew began tracking social media adoption back in 2005. And at that time, 5% of American adults used at least one platform. And by 2011, that share had risen to half of all Americans. And then by last year, 72% of the public uses some type of social media. For example, my mother, she, I won't say how old she was because I don't want lightning to strike me, but she started, I think she got her first Facebook page last year, and for somebody her age, I'll go through based on age demographics, the adoption of social media. So back in 2011, for people who are 18 to 29, so my peers, obviously, 79% of them were on social media. And for people who are 30 to 49 years old, 61%. For the 18 to 29-year-olds, so between 2011 and 2021, it went from 79% to 84%. For 30 to 49, it went from 61% to 81% who are using social media. And for the 50 to 64-year-old set, back in 2011, so 10 years ago, about 40% of them use social media, and then today it's about 73%. And for my mom's set, and that's people who are 65 and older, 10 years ago, 14% of them were on social, and that has risen to about half of that population. So it appears to me from the statistic that I looked at for YouTube and Facebook appear to be far and away the most popular among all groups on social. And of course, by age group, like for instance, you have the Pinterest set, which is probably me, and then you have the people who are on Instagram who are probably maybe a little bit more junior than me. And I think one of the demonstrations of the power of social media and the reach is how what I'll call POTUS has used it. So in President Obama's administration, it went from being an opportunity to display like photo ops, like him in a factory, him at an opening, him playing with Bo, or something like that, to actually advancing, promoting policy. And you saw world leaders do that more and more. And I think it's so common today that we don't think about the trajectory, but it has changed in all of our lifetimes. And again, it's become this ever-present thing that we use to gather information, to advance information. And for President Trump, as Jessica was talking about him, until it came to a screeching halt, Twitter was where he advanced a lot of his ideas. And it became an enormous megaphone for him and a lot of people. But he's, again, he was the president of the United States, and with that stature, it's an awesome platform. And then now, of course, with the ban, he has developed his own social media channel, and so he has now Truth Social, which I'm not very familiar with, but obviously he sees the utility in the import of it. And so it's the rise of social media is very dominant. And for Western Michigan University, the way we use social media is informational, and it's demonstrating a slice of campus life. It's a place where we promote the wonderful things that our faculty and staff are doing. It's where we promote events like this. It's how we engage with the audience. And so social is intended to be social, and so we interact. And because this is focused on free expression, freedom of speech, I thought it'd be important to note that we are not immune to that toxicity and some of the ills of social media when it comes to our own social platforms. But for the most part, we're not stanching criticism, we're not stanching freedom of expression. There's many examples. I went through our social recently just to kind of look at some of the things that are out there. And so, for example, criticism around Buster Bronco. I don't know if you remember what Buster may have looked like at one time, but he got kind of a makeover. He went to the gym, and he had a personal makeover. While COVID was at its height, you saw the split in society reflected on our social, and people feeling as though there's maybe overreaction to this malady that is in our society, and then those who didn't think the protocols are strong enough. When it comes to sports, criticism of coaches and things of that nature. Criticism about higher education in general. Wow, 4-year degree is a waste. Go to a trade school, kids, kind of thing. Universities are bastions of liberalism and wokeness, things of that nature. And so the debate goes on amid commenters, and it's really interesting to view. It's not something that we generally wade into. So if there's like a factual error or something of that nature, then it's a time to step in and at times to set the record straight, because I think one of the ills of social, and as a former journalist, this really just gets my hackles up, is that people will present things as though they're facts, right? And they're not facts necessarily, or they don't show their work. They don't demonstrate where it was they got that information. And because it's on this platform where no matter what you say, so you have a source who is sharing facts and backing those facts up, and then you have somebody who's sharing their opinion, and they're kind of presented as equal. And so that, as I said, it kind of gets my hackles up, because you could take a thread of truth and then spin it out, and it becomes a monster, and it becomes truth, and when it's really not truth. And so that is something that is unfortunate. And so
Yeah, so when you're looking through these and you say that you're setting the facts straight, are you doing that on the accounts that Western owns? Or are you also, is the university also looking at other accounts, not like individual ones, but for example, there's that Ghost Bronco account. Like, does Western go and put comments on those as well?
No.
Okay, so just the ones that we own. One of the interesting things that Justice Thomas brought up in his concurrence was the difference between, so internet companies now, much like the phone companies and the telegraph companies, there's a law that says they can't be held liable for the content that other people put on their platform. They're not the ones communicating. They're just the ones offering it up. And so we have that same thing with the internet, or with social media. So are there times when on Western social media account where it seems we're just offering the information other people have given us, or, spreading it, or is it always our constructed message that is going out to people?
It's typically our message. So, for example, every one of the folks on my staff is highly talented, way more talented than I am, but I get to enjoy their shine. And so they write stories, for example, about the awesome things that students are doing. And so that's a lot of what's on our social media, or it might be, as I said, promoting an event. So it is curated. It's the messaging that we believe reflects the university. And so for the most part, that's the kind of information you're going to see elevated on our social channels.
So, going back to what Justice Thomas was saying, about that is the phone companies and the telegraph companies, in exchange for getting that legal protection, they agreed to be subject to some federal regulation. There's certain things that the phone companies and the telegraph companies have to do to follow the federal regulation. At the moment, the social media companies, while they have that protection in the law, oh, am I mute? Sorry. There, okay. So the social media companies, while they have that protection in the law, have not subjected themselves, or the federal government hasn't chosen to subject them to federal regulation. So it's just kind of interesting that we're using this as a means of public communication, even though it is a private platform. So Paul and I, being our Gen X selves, need to turn this over to Caitlin to give us a little bit more information on, the ins and outs of how Western uses social media, and kind of what do you do in your day, and how or if any of these questions of free speech come across your desk or in your mind as you're doing your job.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a lot that goes into my day-to-day more than just creating a post. And so we with the university are really trying to use our social media platforms to meet our audience and our students and our prospective students where they're at, and that's on social. Most recently, our TikTok page, and creating that because that's where our prospective students are spending a lot of their time. And so our social media platforms are a collaboration between my work, our news team, our design team, and of course the units across campus. So we're really trying to use the social media platforms as an additional media tool to elevate the university and to get our message and that communication out there.
Okay. So what kind of communications do you have in terms of like the back and forth, like Paula was saying?
Yeah, so that can be anything to where I know in the height of COVID, there were some questions around testing or things like that. And so that was something where we would ask Syndicuse to step in and to answer those questions because they have all that information. They know the ins and outs of where to do that, when to do that, and where you can get that done. And so sometimes it's as easy as having someone step in and answer a question like that, or sometimes it's a little fun play back and forth where someone's like, wow, like we love Buster, or where can we get something like this? And so we jump in and say, oh, you can grab this at the bookstore, or if it's something we have in our office, maybe we can share that with you and get that to you. So it can be as lighthearted or a little more informational.
And has there been a situation where you've had to step in and block somebody or delete a post or anything like that?
So we do not block people, and we take a very light hand with moderation. Just as Facebook policies, we kind of stick to that policy too. The only time that we take down comments or something along those lines is when it's a personal attack, and that could be on race, religion, gender identity, and it can go back and forth. But we have a very light hand on moderation until it comes to cyberbullying and attacking someone personally.
So I'm checking my phone only because the crew here is communicating with me about it. So I'm not doing other things. If you guys could just speak up a little bit, that would be great. So it's interesting you say that you will take down things if there's a personal insult or something like that, because that, under free speech, you can do that as long as you're not physically keeping somebody from going about their business. But it's a lot easier to do, again, in person than it is to regulate, on social media. So, have there been times where you've kind of had to have the internal discussion or weigh it? Well, technically, yeah, they could probably say this legally say it, but we also need to weigh the university's interests and, protecting our students and that sort of thing, and go back and forth, or is that just in the legal office where we do stuff like that?
I can think of, really for the most part, for our social, as toxic and as much of a cesspool, frankly, social can be. We don't see a lot of it, but I can think of a couple instances, and I won't elevate the kinds of things that were said, where there was a specific attack against a student and that student's characteristics of the student, I would say. And so that's not something that we do tolerate. But as I said, there's no shortage of criticism, on social media, and that's true when you're an organization, and that's true when you're a politician, et cetera, et cetera. So as Caitlin was saying, we take a very light touch, and if it's something to the extreme of attacking one of our students for, let's say, characteristics, then we don't tolerate that.
Well, and I will say so under
because we
the
see
law,
that as cyberbullying.
Yeah, when it's and see that's the cyberbullying according to Michigan statute. There's got to be the intent, which is interesting, and the law does not protect individual insult. You are, whatever. That's different than standing out and saying, I am morally against this group of people generally. And so those are treated differently. And again, it's a balancing test. So the university has a very strong interest in protecting its students so that they can have the right to an equal education. So we haven't, Emma, we don't have any questions online? Not yet. Okay. So one of the questions that going back to this public-private balance of, in free speech, it's a public forum. There's places on campus where we need to allow people, and the government cannot stop people based on the content of their speech. There are some other reasons that we can regulate it, but in a public forum, if we've treated it as a public forum, we can't say, I like what you're saying and I don't like what you're saying, so you can come and you can't. Versus the areas of private control, where under the private control, the free speech protections don't apply when you're in a private company. So looking at this question of President Trump and Twitter, I'm going to ask you guys first, but then I also would love to get some feedback on here. How would you do that? How would you weigh that? And Justice Thomas basically in his concurring opinion said, I don't know, these are good questions and I can see it go both ways. He indicated he would likely lean more towards it because Twitter can unilaterally shut somebody down. It's private and not public, and therefore the user can block, regardless of who the user is, can block the people. But he did say that he sees the arguments on both sides. So what are your thoughts?
So as it relates to
Justice Thomas is kind of a smart guy.
Yes, he is. He's way smarter than I am. I will admit that. Right. So yeah, I'm not a legal scholar, but just for me personally, so I know that, as we talked about this platform or social is like it proliferates, it dominates. It's something that people use as part of their daily lives all the time, and it is seen as a public forum. It is seen as a public square. However, if you're a private entity, you're a private company, you do get to determine, what goes on in your environment. So for instance, somebody can say whatever they want on the street in front of my house, say that I invite them in to my private dwelling and, there's something that I don't appreciate that they're doing in my environment, then I can invite them to leave. And it's the same thing with Twitter. You may not like that, but it's not an arm of the government. So it's a private company. And so if it chooses to block someone based on its rules and regulations, if a person has violated those, then that is the company's prerogative to do that.
But what if the user is using it as an arm of the government, the way President Trump did? Does that change your opinion at all?
Not really. I mean, unless correct me if I'm wrong, attorney, but if that becomes a publicly traded company, it becomes a public company, I think the rules change. I think for President Trump, he, as I mentioned, I believe it's Truth Social. I think that's the entity that he created. He chose to go elsewhere and to advance his message, and that's an opportunity. That's a choice. I can go elsewhere. I can continue to advance my message, and I'm just going to go to a different public square, one that I control, one that's not going to shut me down.
Now, you just said public square that I control. Those two things don't happen at the same time. It's one or the other. So that's kind of where we're
A platform that he controls. So.
Okay. I mean, that is where we're stuck. What do you think, Caitlin?
Yeah, I mean, I think Twitter's a monster of its own.
Especially now Elon Musk is almost buying it.
Yeah,
wow.
Twitter doesn't have a whole lot of regulations behind it, whereas we see on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, there is a lot more filtering through the platforms themselves, not on our end, through the platforms themselves, and so they take things really seriously, and there's things that they won't stand for, whereas I feel like Twitter, a lot of people say what they want, and there's nothing you can do about it, which is difficult at times.
So thoughts from the audience on this? Twitter technically is a private company and can regulate. At the same time, you don't get much more public forum than that anybody in the world with email access can speak on Twitter up to a certain point. Thoughts on if you were the Supreme Court and this is coming across your desk, what are some things you would consider? Margaret.
What about regulation, like TV and radio? Because there's some days are going to be regulation that would make this more clear, these types of situations. Because right now we're pretty much operating in an absence of regulation for social media platforms as compared to what TV and radio. Is there any correlation there? Is there any help that could provide in the future?
So Margaret asked about regulation, how there's regulation for TV and radio, and we don't have any regulation for this. I do not have an eye into Congress right now, but that is something that Justice Thomas mentioned in his concurring opinion, is the TV and radio, as we said, in exchange for the legal protection, they agreed to be regulated by the government. Right now, social media has the legal protection. They are not being regulated by the government. The more regulation that there is, the closer this gets to a public forum and a public entity. So that would move the needle one way or the other. Anybody over here? You all look very intent in following.
I just have to say that I, as a private citizen, have the option not to go there if I don't like what is being said. So I always have the ultimate control over that.
Right.
So, if this is a private enterprise and there is no regulations for it, then I just move out of there because I disagree with what I did here.
Yep. So she was saying that it's a private enterprise, and so you just don't need to. I'm sorry, if you don't like what they're being said, you can move on. You can go somewhere else. Again, this is a little bit different than the government, right? When the government is speaking, there's kind of a assumption that I believe you should listen, right? As an informed citizen, you should listen to what the government's saying. I don't need to listen to people I disagree with on Twitter. Should I? Is a different question. And that's something we've all talked about, the echo chambers and how it's so easy to depersonalize people who are posting things versus if I'm sitting and having a conversation with you and we disagree, I can see how my words are affecting you. When you post, you can't see that. Emma, did you have?
Yeah, related to that idea, Jennifer Townsend in the chat, our friend.
Hello, Jennifer.
Said the problem is that when an arguable majority of the world's population uses social media for communication, and social media platforms choose to censor communications with which they disagree, it effectively silences a group of people from being able to practice what we think of as free speech. Can you go elsewhere? Yes, but there isn't always an elsewhere to go.
That's a very good point. And it also goes back to, we need to hear what each other is saying. And if everybody who says things that I personally believe are way out there, I still need to know that they're saying them. And so if those people leave and go somewhere else and they're not on my social media channel, I'm not hearing those. And again, the population is getting segmented. And Jennifer is one of our fabulous supporters who has spoken on these programs before. And we love having her point of view. Margaret.
And I would just add that, if it hasn't been mentioned, that it's the algorithms of the social media platforms that channel like-minded thinkers to our news feeds. So that's another good reason for us to be seeking out these other opinions, because what falls in our news feed is intentionally falling there to be with the like-minded people that are in our sphere.
Right. And Margaret was talking about the algorithms point you to the things that you're more likely to look at based on what you've already looked at. So I wonder if, and if anybody has wants to steer the conversation in a different way, feel free to jump in. Is maybe the solution, should the government start its own platform for social media? What do you think?
So just in my own experience, I've noticed that with the military, the Air Force uses Facebook a lot as an official platform for communication, which is really frustrating for a lot of people who don't have Facebook, because you're forced to then make a Facebook. And that's something that I experienced that was really annoying, is the official form of communication with Facebook posts. And that kind of gets into that same area, because if the person running that page is a normal person, but part of the DoD, and this happened on Twitch as well. There was a gaming something, and they banned a user from saying something because they were basically harassing the channel, saying he was going to work on whatever. They blocked him, and it was a whole controversy because it was censorship of an individual person expressing whatever. But I think that there definitely should be an alternative, and without that regulation, for the government to use it as an official platform of communication is kind of, I don't think it works out very well.
That's a really good point. So he was saying that the DoD, Department of Defense, different branches are using Facebook as a method for their official communication, similar to what President Trump was doing, and that if you don't have access or just don't want a Facebook page, you're kind of stuck. And I've come across that myself too. After the 2016 election, I was like, I'm out. I'm done with Facebook. But a lot of, in my volunteer work, groups that I want to work with, Facebook's free, so that all their stuff is on there as opposed to paying for a web page. So in addition to, and then was it DoD that blocked that user, or was it the platform?
So it was somebody who was representing the DoD esports team.
Oh, okay.
So it got kind of, it's a gray area, because it's an official government-sponsored channel on Twitch, but it was just some 20-year-old who blocked them.
Yeah, so it was an official government-sponsored esports team. So it was the government who stepped in. Now, a point that is interesting is that and especially as military members and public employees, I worked for VA for 10 years. As public employees, you don't have the same free speech rights in your capacity as a public employee, and especially the military, as you would as a citizen walking down the street. So when we're talking about the balancing test, the government has a stronger interest in what you say when you are its employee than just a normal person walking down the street. So some of these things, you say, well, my boss, well, if your boss is the state, depending on what it is, and there actually was a really interesting case about it. It was an assistant attorney general here in Michigan who had it out for the president of the student council at U of M because the president of the student council was gay, and the assistant attorney general didn't like the lifestyle. But what was happening is, because of the post that the state employee was making against the U of M student, they had complaints coming into the Attorney General's office to the point where they had to have somebody full-time answering all of these complaints because he was so visible. He was on Jon Stewart and Anderson Cooper and all of these things. So in that case, the court said, yeah, you can do your personal thing, but when it stops the government from being able to serve the people, which is what the government is supposed to do, the government's got a much higher interest in making sure that you don't do that so it doesn't affect your government work. That's really interesting. So what I was saying was, should the government have its own social media platform? But then what is that? That the government can regulate, they can, by doing that, they cannot regulate based on content, except for a few. There's exceptions for true threats and, obscenity. And by obscenity, really the only thing that counts at this point is child porn is really the only thing, illegal stuff. Thoughts?
Yeah. I think the reason that the government is trying to, like the rest of us, leverage these platforms that are very popular, right? And so, I'd be interested to see, how much traffic a, Department of Defense or Ag or whatever governmental division, how much traction they would get starting their own social platform. So, it may be something that entities want to look at, but, and then they would have to apply all the laws and, rights and all those things that the government has to adhere to safeguard our rights and also present information that is vetted and that is appropriate for the public sphere. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion about that. I just don't think it would be that successful.
Yeah, I don't think it would be that successful either, but I also think it gets a little sticky because then which side of the government is controlling it? Is it something that's pretty neutral, or is it then Democratic or Republican based on who's in office? And then maybe there's lack of freedom of speech there as well because we're only seeing one side of or one party's opinion or something along those lines.
That's interesting. I thought of something else. Oh, so like after the 2016 election, you saw these alt government, like the alt EPA had a Twitter account, and the alt National Park Service had a Twitter account of kind of like it was a satirical, we're taking over because the President Trump's administration was not as EPA friendly as previous ones. So the employees there said, we're going to create our own and put out our views as private citizens who work for the EPA. It's very interesting. We don't know. This is so new. And as a constitutional scholar, I think it's super interesting. I also agree that we could get in some really big trouble as a nation and a democracy if we don't step out of that sphere. And spread our wings a little bit instead of only focusing on who we talk to. Yeah.
One of the things that I wasn't actually raising my hand, but a thought that I had. This is.
I know you're a quiet speaker. Talk louder.
Sorry. So I think this was a little bit before my time, but so in terms of the regulation of television and radio. I think there was a time on TV where you could sell like cigarettes, and I think I kind of remember that. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just hallucinating. I don't know. But I wonder about the milieu or what the environment was like that allowed for that kind of regulation, that people were not maybe up in arms about it. I mean, freedom of expression, being able to freely see the images that you want, that's not new. That was back in the 1970s. I don't know if the country was as polarized as it is today, but I just wonder if maybe something like that, this is a question that nobody really knows the answer to, but I'd be interested in hearing what people's thoughts are. Would the government be able to do that kind of regulation for social media channels? Or is that just no way in today's environment would that ever possibly happen? Genie's out of the bottle, forget it.
Right. Well, part of that is what I was saying before, because it's a common carrier, TV agreed to be regulated and agreed to have some of those restrictions because they also got the governmental protections. That's a great question. Anybody? I think I remember that too, when they switched from having the alcohol or cigarettes, and then I feel like alcohol was banned for a while, and then it was back.
No, was it that you couldn't? Obviously, we all see beer commercials, but I'm not sure about hard liquor.
Yeah,
if
yeah. I don't
spirits
know.
can
I've
be
seen like
promoted.
Smirnoff stuff.
Oh, okay. Well,
Anyway.
that's true. That's true. Not a product I partake in.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Nobody else online, Miss Emma? Okay. Thank you, everybody. Does anybody have any other thoughts? I don't want to stifle conversation, since that's what we're here for. Yeah.
So I had a question. So earlier you guys made the argument that free speech is a public platform, or sorry, social media is a public platform. And you mentioned that around 72% of Americans access essentially free speech through these public platforms. Then you also, on the other hand, say that, well, they're a private entity, so they have the ability to regulate what goes on in their platform, their public platform. Do you think that creates a double standard for free speech and what's allowed to be said?
So what he's saying is we had talked about social media being a public platform and also a private platform, and that does that create a double standard based on the content of the speech? Is that okay? I'm not speaking for you guys, but I was not making the argument that it is a public platform. I was saying that these are the issues that are out there, and that the Second Circuit found that specific to President Trump and how he was using the platform while he was in office, in that situation, it became a public platform. And they were very clear that they were using those specifics. If he had been a private citizen, that's different. If he had been even as the president, but tweeting about personal things, that's different. I think it does. It could arguably. That's why nobody knows the answer to these questions, because is it public or is it private? It's got elements of both. Government can't shut down speech based on content. Private entities can. You guys want to weigh in?
Yeah, and I think that's what I was saying. Twitter, for example, is a private platform. It's a private company that the public uses. Millions and millions of people use it. But because it is a private entity, it does have rules and regulations of its own and can shut down that speech. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's what can happen, and that's what does happen.
I think too on social, a little off topic here, but we see a sense of checks and balances between the public themselves, to whereas maybe it is something that isn't regulated, but then people come in and kind of banter back and forth and have that argument. And so you are seeing that different side of opinions across all platforms.
Yeah.
Well, you know what's interesting? I'm just checking the clock to make sure we got. I was listening to NPR the other day, and there's a group of former TikTok employees whose job it was, so on Twitter and Facebook and Insta, there's an algorithm that kicks out the really bad stuff. TikTok, it's not an algorithm, it's individuals. And so these employees were saying, the one woman who was talking it was her job to review the videos of literally people being shot in the face, of kids being abused, of all of these things. And it was her job to make sure that those got kicked off and the rest of us didn't see it. Her argument being that she was saying that the TikTok didn't offer, it was basically employee abuse sort. That's not the legal term, but TikTok didn't offer enough of the mental health support, didn't explain this position before she took it. It was kind of like, here you go. And so she spends 8 hours a day looking at these horrendous things. I don't have a point other than to say, I think that it is appropriate for them to kick those things off. Now, if it's illegal, you don't have a right to free speech for something that's illegal. One of the examples I use when I give my free speech talk is I can't sue my drug dealer because he didn't give me the drugs that I wanted because it's illegal. Like, the courts are going to be like, no. I just found that to be a really interesting lawsuit, and I will be very interested to see where it goes and what happens with it. Not really a free speech thing, but it has to do with the entities regulating themselves. Emma.
Since we have a few extra minutes, I have a question. One thing that I think is really pervasive in social media right now is the idea of cancel culture. I think social media is what has created that. I don't think it would exist without social media. And so from that perspective is you see a lot of groupthink, a lot of, one person identifies this person as being one way or another, sometimes maybe justified, sometimes maybe not. So from a perspective of like this harassment piece, right? Like where, do you think there's some way of intervention to prevent like this unnecessary, you have this open platform, someone tweeted it, they have, 500,000 followers or whatever, and now like they're experiencing endless harassment, and the only real way to avoid that is to either leave the platform, or I guess now you can shut down comments, but then is that limiting people's speech too, to be able to say, if this is a public official that's being canceled, should people be able to comment on that because, we have that right to free speech, the right to kind of criticize our government, whatever that might be.
Yeah. Does your microphone pick her up, or do I need? Okay. What do you guys think?
I would just speak from what I've seen on our social media channels, and as I mentioned, just like every other social account out there, you have people bantering back and forth, and it's really interesting to see. We don't wade into the debate, but it's interesting to see people go back and forth. And what I've noticed is there's a degree of decorum on our social channels that I don't see elsewhere. I do think that as a public official, you are going to be subject to criticism. I mean, don't be a public official if you don't want to be criticized. I think that's the answer to that. So that kind of thing comes with the territory. If you're someone who's operating on behalf of the public for the public gets to
And in fact, in
critique.
defamation law, it's treated differently if you're a public official versus a private official in terms of what people can say without getting in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Now, did that come into place as a little bit different in terms of defamation? But of course, we know that Sarah Palin sued, I believe it was the New York Times, and I don't know if there was a higher standard because she, was a public official, but she was a public official. I don't even think she was governor at that time.
Well, each state is different. This is where it gets a little confusing, but in general, yeah, it comes. And what's interesting is, if I'm remembering this correctly, in the United States, truth is a defense to defamation. Our law was based on common law from Britain, and in Britain, that is not a defense, which is really interesting to me. But yeah, as a public official, you have to take more than you would as a private individual. What were you gonna say?
From a different standpoint than the public officials, I think cancel culture is really negative sometimes. I mean, sometimes people get canceled for something, most of the time, people get canceled for something that technically isn't necessarily true, and someone just puts something out on social and it gets a lot of traction, and then all of a sudden this individual, whether it be an influencer or a celebrity, like I said, aside from the government standpoint, can take a lot of negativity and harassment, and it gets to a point where, like you said, Emma, they either have to decide to turn comments off, which then is that a lack of free speech there, or leave the platform, and maybe that platform is where they make their income or something along those lines. So it gets a little touchy with cancel culture, and I think that is something that has developed strictly because of social media.
Well, and the comments thing, it's you turning off the comments on your stuff. So as a public entity, I think that might be different, because it's different than Twitter turning off the comments. If you individually are choosing to turn off the comments and you're a government official and this is your government account, I think that would be different than Taylor Swift turning off the comments on her thing. And then again, the cancel culture, there was that election worker, I think it was in Georgia or something like that, where somebody posted something absolutely false. It had been proven false by everybody from the top to the bottom, and this person was still getting death threats. I mean, it's based on one person posting and people sharing it. So yeah, I mean, and I think that's kind of how we started this whole thing, is like, social has a lot of really good utility. It allows people from all walks of life to have their voices heard to a certain extent. If all walks of life, assuming that you are privileged enough to have a computer or a smartphone or something like that. And people don't have to see the individual reactions. And someone from Alaska can comment directly to somebody in North Carolina without even knowing this person. So I don't know, it's interesting, and we don't have answers to this one. Yeah?
Just an interest, just a note. So YouTube recently, I don't know how recently, but they made some changes. So if you're a content creator on YouTube and you make content that is aimed or marketed at kids, it will automatically, as a platform, not allow comments on the video, just overall. So that's kind of an interesting approach that they have.
Yeah, that is interesting. He was saying that YouTube, if you're marketing towards kids, they've turned off the comments. As a mother of a 9-year-old, I appreciate that. Yeah, and as a private platform, they can do that. Wonderful. Thank you so much. If you have any other questions or anything, you can email the three of us. You can email Margaret, Emma, the We Talk people, and see us back here next month. Margaret? Next month. Could be. Stay tuned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.